and stay until the end for more info on donating to AAM. So welcome to another educational and inspiring AAM program. In this workshop, attorney Brad Thomson will discuss how the government tries to keep activists from being effective and how activists can combat this repression. He will discuss the history of the FBI's counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO, also known as grand juries, and more. So my name is Michelle Granberg. I'm your moderator. I'm a mentor and team member with Animal Activism Mentorship. I'm located in New Jersey, and I've been a vegan and activist for over 6 years. Our mission at AAM is to empower activists to boldly act and equip them with what they need to fight for animal liberation. AAM teaches specific tools to help activists lay a strong foundation for years to come. We offer a free 3-month mentorship program designed for activists at all levels, where we pair experienced activists with aspiring activists. Through one-on-one mentoring, we generate an increased number of effective activists worldwide because we all know this movement needs more activists. Additionally, we offer free workshops that train and educate our mentors like this, mentees and the public on various aspects of animal rights activism. We have a podcast called the Animal Liberation Hour, and we host large-scale in-person activism events. AAM is proud to be fueled by FARM, the Farm to Animal Rights Movement, one of the oldest AR organizations in the country. If you're interested in applying to become a mentor or mentee, or want to get involved or to donate, please visit our website, animalactivismmentorship.com, and follow both AAM and FARM on social media. Okay, more to come later about AAM, but now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. Brad Thomson works at People's Law Office as a civil rights and criminal defense lawyer. In addition to being a lawyer, Brad has worked as a licensed private investigator and has a background in political organizing. Brad's work at People's Law Office has focused on civil rights litigation against the Chicago police, including suits for wrongful conviction, death during incarceration, false arrest, police shootings, and other cases of state violence. Additionally, he has successfully obtained the release for a number of political activists who spent decades in prison, including the Move 9 and Black Liberation elder Mutulu Shakur. Brad's legal interests include aspects of animal law, particularly the criminalization of animal rights activists. He has studied and written about the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, AETA, and has worked on cases defending animal liberation activists who were charged under the AETA. Brad is an active member of the National Lawyers Guild, NLG, and was named the NLG's Legal Worker of the Year in 2011. All right, so he's bringing all that expertise to us tonight. We're very happy. We will open up for Q&A after Brad's presentation, so hold your questions until then. And now I'm going to turn it over to you, Brad.
All right, thank you, Michelle, and thank you everyone for coming. I'm really excited to see all of y'all here, especially that there's people from all around the country and outside the country as well. This is really exciting, and I'm happy to be here with you. Like Michelle said, I'm going to try to wrap up so we can have some time for Q&A at the end. To give just a little bit of information about the office where I work, People's Law Office was founded in 1969, specifically to provide legal support to the radical social movements that were active in that era. And that's the anti-war movement, Black Power movement fighting for independence in Puerto Rico, and other sort of organizations and individuals really fighting for radical social change. And as Michelle said, you know, our suits, we also have lawsuits where we file claims against the city of Chicago and suing cops, prisons, and other state actors that violate the Constitution. Now, personally, give a little bit of background about myself. As Michelle mentioned, you know, I come from an organizing background, and I did that work before becoming a lawyer and before getting involved in the law. I now have been vegan. It will be 25 years this August. And I come to animal liberation from an anti-oppression, anti-capitalist, anti-authoritarian perspective. And in my view, I think that you can't talk about the liberation of animals without talking about capitalism, exploitation, and oppression of humans, the environment. And it's important to me to sort of recognize how all of these forms of oppression fit together so that we can really talk about liberation in a way that frees animals and all the oppressed and exploited living things. Now, I want to give just a brief overview. Like Michelle said, I'll be talking about COINTELPRO and then the use of terrorism charges against political activists and grand juries, and then wrap up with sort of finding out what you can do to defend yourself and your movements around this. I see a lot of people's cameras are off. If people are comfortable either sharing emojis or if your cameras are on, if this is the type of stuff that you feel familiar with and you can give a thumbs up either on screen or on your emoji, or give a wave or a sort of shake the hand if you feel like, you know what, this is kind of brand new to me. And so that might give me a little bit of a sense about where people are at. And, I'm not going to be able to cover everything. And this is information that really, if it's brand new to you, that's great. That's really important. Even if you have some background on this, it's still going to be really important. Just preparing for this presentation, I learned some new stuff, refreshed my knowledge about some of this. And so there's plenty to be learned here. And what is going on in the streets and in our movements is always evolving. So there's always more to learn. And one other thing is, this info can be pretty intense and intimidating, especially if you're new to it. But it's really important to learn this because having this knowledge can be empowering. And again, I want to really emphasize what we can do to protect ourselves against state repression. And so I really want to end it with some time for us to talk about that and answer any questions there. So starting off, COINTELPRO was known as counterintelligence programs. And these were programs established by the FBI between 1956 and 1971. And they were specifically targeting individuals and organizations who were part of social movements. Now, traditional investigative techniques that you think of in law enforcement are perceived as intelligence. And that's when they're gathering information through a variety of means, surveillance, and other sort of techniques where you're really, the police are really just gaining information. And then when they believe they've seen enough evidence of a crime, they make arrests, make charges, etc. And the FBI has always done this throughout its existence, and they've always done this against political movements throughout their existence. Now, counterintelligence is a bit more unique, and that's really because the goal of counterintelligence is not just to be passively observing, but it's actually intervening in the movements that are going on. And so from the COINTELPRO documents, we've learned that there was a specific plan by the federal government to, quote, expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize social movements that were trying to create change in the United States. Now, these were largely targeting communist and socialist groups initially, and then expanded to the American Indian movement, independence movements, particularly Puerto Rican independence movement, the New Left and anti-war movements like Students for Democratic Society. But really, it was some of the most intense was against Black power movements and Black liberation movements of that era. And that was especially against groups like the Black Panther Party. Now, it's also important to know, however, that there were also COINTEL programs that were against right-wing groups and the Ku Klux Klan specifically. And I think that that's important to keep in mind, because a lot of times progressive movements, organizations fighting for liberal radical social change support the government going against their enemies. And there's a lot of that when we saw around January 6th, for example, of saying, these people are domestic terrorists and they should be treated as such. And the danger in that is the government, when they have those tools, they then flip that always against those fighting against oppression. And it's disproportionate in the amount of state repression used against groups like the Black Panthers, for example, versus the Ku Klux Klan. And there is a there is a book that's really good at highlighting some of these discrepancies that is called Something Happening Here by David Cunningham that I would recommend. And other books on COINTELPRO, and there's the COINTELPRO Papers is another book that is available online for free. And these give good background on the way in which these tactics are used. Now, specifically, I want to talk about some of the specific tactics, and these involved infiltration, where people were either in the FBI or civilians being paid by the FBI to actually join organizations and actually attempt to influence what those organizations were doing. There were also tactics to discredit and disrupt the movements. And so the goal there was to scare off supporters. And they would use a variety of tactics for that. But a lot of times that would be where there were any sort of groups that were in tension with one another. And the FBI would exploit that tension. So for example, here in Chicago, the Black Panther Party was making inroads at organizing with Black-led gangs on the west and south sides of Chicago, and to build up support to say, you know what, we need to stop fighting each other in the streets and really challenging society and really build up our communities. Now, the FBI wrote fake letters to people that were leaders within the gangs pretending to be Black Panthers to really disrupt those tensions, or really escalate those tensions and disrupt those attempts at collective organizing there. Similarly, they used psychological warfare, where there would be false stories, bogus letters, misinformation that the FBI was putting out. And one of the most notable examples there was targeting Martin Luther King Jr., where the FBI was sending letters to Martin Luther King telling him to kill himself, and that they had information that they were using as blackmail to expose him. And this was not done clearly as being the FBI. It was all done secretively and under the guise of an anonymous letter from somebody who had information about Martin Luther King. Now, another tactic was harassment through the legal system, and that was bogus, trumped up charges where people would be arrested either for really minor infractions, and then they would be increased and given massive charges, things like possession of small amounts of drugs that the police would then have huge charges for, or sometimes just purely manufactured charges where something didn't even take place, but the police charged people for it and arrested them. And a lot of times the goal wasn't actually to get convictions, it was just to redirect all the energy into people having to defend themselves. And finally, one of the most egregious tactics was extra legal force and violence at the hands of the state. And the most notable example there was Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. They were Black Panthers. I don't know if people are familiar, Black Panthers that were killed in December of 1969. And that was where the Chicago police, along with the prosecutors in Cook County, Illinois, with the help and support of the FBI, raided Fred Hampton's home and shot 100 bullets into the apartment, killing both Fred Hampton, who was a very dynamic young leader of the Black Panther Party's chapter in Illinois, along with Mark Clark, who was another Illinois leader of the Black Panther Party. And my office actually was was the office that represented the families of Mark Clark and Fred Hampton in bringing a lawsuit against the police and the FBI. And you can read about that. There's a book that I believe Trey might be sharing in the chat, that is The Assassination of Fred Hampton. That was written by one of the founding partners of People's Law Office, Jeff Haas. And that gives a lot of background both on Fred Hampton, his life, his legacy, and COINTELPRO, and all the information that lawyers from my office uncovered about COINTELPRO throughout the 70s and into the 80s as a result of that lawsuit. And, here's share the screen here. And this was a document that I can also share this send a link to this. I believe this is on the People's Law Office website somewhere, but this is a document that lawyers from our office created in 1980 about the history of COINTELPRO, and as you can see, a look at America's secret police. And People's Law Office was able to find out information about COINTELPRO because it had been exposed by underground activists in 1971. The only reason that any of us know about this is because the FBI kept very detailed records on all of the actions that they were doing. And J. Edgar Hoover, who's featured here, it was the head of the FBI, and he required all the chapters of the FBI, every field office, to be engaged in counterintelligence activities and to report to him. In 1971, underground activists raided a FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, and then released the documents to the media. And that opened up a huge exposure as to all the activities that COINTELPRO was doing. And there's a really good documentary about that that's called 1971. It used to be on Netflix. I'm not sure if it's still on there now. And there's also a book called The Burglary that is by Betty Metzger that I believe Trey can share in the chat as well. So, what is important to me in looking back at COINTELPRO, particularly in the exposure on this, is the fact that it was lots of people coming together in order to expose this, right? It was people that went underground, that did an underground action, broke into the FBI office, and then shared that information with the media. And then there were journalists and activists that were spreading that information more broadly. And then politicians and lawyers from my office did more investigation. And, lawyers from my office were able to get a lot of that information out there. So I think it shows a way of the importance of diversity of tactics and how different people are working together there. And I also think that one of the important lessons that we can learn here is that even though COINTELPRO was officially disbanded after this was exposed in 1971, a lot of these tactics continue, but not under the same naming structure and not necessarily in quite as organized of a way. But a lot of these tactics still exist. And what's important for people who are part of movements is to recognize that what the government was able to really successfully do there was disrupt what was already being disrupted, right? When there were already tensions between organizations that were collective and part of the same movement, the FBI would escalate those tensions. And they would do that through disinformation. So what's important as activists is to, pay attention to what's going on, learn about principled disagreements, and really engage in that kind of political, theoretical disagreement about the issue, but also make sure that you're coming at this from a place of solidarity and not just attacking other organizations, attacking other individuals when you are fighting for the same thing. So when you're fighting for the liberation of animals and there's other people and other movements doing that are really agreeing about on your core principles, that it's important not to let your personality disagreements or other sorts of tensions really blow up to the point that you're not able to be successful. And one of the most important things, always remind yourself here is the reason the government's attacking folks is because they are being successful. And so, that's going to bring me to the next point here, that is around the use of the terrorism label to describe political activists. Now, this is something that's gone on for over a century, that the US government has identified any opposition as being quote unquote terrorists. We saw that through the Red Scare in the early 20th century. That continued through the revolutionary movements in the 60s and 70s. And then that really increased after 9/11. And during the early 2000s, we particularly saw that with the Green Scare. And again, if I can get a sort of thumbs up on people if they're familiar with the Green Scare and the history of that. Okay, so a little bit. So, in the late 90s, there were some animal rights activists and environmental activists that were having really profound success. And they were really utilizing a lot of more direct action tactics, really hitting targets hard, some of those being through explicitly illegal means. And, particularly groups like the Animal Liberation Front and the Earth Liberation Front that were doing underground tactics to liberate animals, to commit property destruction against the corporations and the industries that were exploiting animals, that were exploiting the earth. And after 9/11, the US government made a decision that animal rights activists and environmental activists were the quote unquote #1 domestic terrorism threat in the United States. And so we saw that in a number of different ways. And there were a lot of cases brought against activists where they were being labeled terrorists, where a lot of the actions were often just property destruction. No humans were harmed. There wasn't any sort of threats of harm. It was tactical property destruction in often, under the cover of night to damage property. And that was often deemed by the government as terrorist acts. But we also saw that expand beyond that. And one of those, and I'm seeing a comment here, is the use of the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, or what was also previously known as the Animal Enterprise Protection Act. And that is, most notably, it was used against the Shack 7. Again, I'm not sure if that's something that people are familiar with, but the Shack 7 were 6 activists and an organization known as Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty. And these here are the individuals who were charged with domestic terrorism because they essentially led a campaign and a website that was a broad-based international campaign against Huntington Life Sciences, which was a corporation that was doing contract work, specifically doing animal testing. And the government's theory wasn't that any of these individuals were committing any of the illegal acts where property was being destroyed or anything like that, but rather that they were conspiring with others to allow these crimes to take place. And they were indicted under the version of the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act that first existed in 1992. And because of Shack's success, which again, I'm not sure how familiar people are with Shack and that history, but it was an extremely dynamic movement and campaign that was highly successful by really going after not just Huntington Life Sciences, but any company that was supporting Huntington Life Sciences. And so those sort of targets, where it would be the law firm that represented Huntington Life Science, or a company that was doing advertising for them or accounting for them, they would get targeted by animal rights activists, and those companies had to make a decision. They're all capitalists, and they had to make a decision like, well, we're getting attacked and we're losing money because of these animal rights activists, and we're only making a little bit of money by our contract with this corporation. Let's just drop our contract. And that ended up making it where Huntington Life Science was really, really decimated by the campaign. And in response, the government increased and expanded the potential of the Animal Enterprise Protection Act, and it became known as the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. And at that point, in 2006, this is after September 11th, there's a lot of 9/11 terrorism hysteria. And so the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act expanded the language where all it required was causing financial loss, and also specifically companies that did business with animal enterprises were then protected essentially by the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. And that was in direct response to the success of the Shack 7, or I'm sorry, of the Shack campaign, and to target people like the Shack 7. And as somebody mentioned in the chat, a really good documentary that I hope people have seen, or that, if not, to check out, is called The Animal People. And it's about the history of the campaign in this case. Now, following that, once the AETA was put into place, it was largely used against people who were participating in underground animal liberation actions. And so, for example, there was BJ Veal and Alex Hall were two activists who were indicted under the AETA in Utah, I believe, for liberating mink. And there was also somebody known as Walter Bond, who was indicted under the AETA for burning down some buildings that were owned by animal enterprises. And so that was, I believe it was a leather factory, and then in a restaurant that sold foie gras, if I'm remembering correctly. And again, nobody was harmed in these actions, but the government deemed these as being quote unquote terrorism. And other instances, there was an activist named Scott DeMuth, and my office was involved in representing Scott DeMuth for being charged in a few different actions related to liberating animals. And then also Tyler Lang and Kevin Johnson, later on, a few years later, were indicted under the AETA, again, for liberating mink here in Illinois. And I was also, again, part of that team working on representing them during those charges. And a book that I would recommend in learning more about the Shack 7, the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, and then the Green Scare more broadly. And, the Earth Liberation Front has a really dynamic history that I'd encourage people to check out. And there was a documentary, or I'm sorry, a podcast that came out recently called Burn Wild that goes into that history. People who were convicted under as part of the Earth Liberation Front actions had a lot of strong critiques of it, but I do think that it gives some good background. So, listen with a grain of salt, but that Burn Wild is a podcast that's worth checking out. And another example of terrorism, the terrorism label being used against activists, is going on right now that people are probably familiar with in Atlanta, Georgia. And, there's a movement to stop the destruction of the Weelaunee Forest in South Atlanta. And the city of Atlanta is planning to demolish acres and acres of forests to build a $90 million cop city, where it would be a training center where the police can learn more techniques to further repress and oppress communities of color throughout the city of Atlanta. And there's people that have taken to defending the forest through a variety of tactics, but including living in the trees. And the government has recently targeted those folks, made mass arrests, and there's now 19 people who are being charged under a state statute for domestic terrorism in the state of Georgia. And so one of the important things I think, and one of the takeaways around this is that, as some people have mentioned in the chat, people are being called terrorists for literally opening up cages and letting animals out of cages where they were going to be killed. And they're deemed as terrorists, not the companies that are raising animals to exploit them and then kill them. They're not being perceived as terrorists. So it's not an even playing field. And I think there's a tendency, because of the weight that is associated with the word terrorism, that people get scared off by it. And so I think it's important for activists to really not let the government get away with that. And so that means coming to the defense of people even when they are being called terrorists, and not taking that term at face value. So I think that's important to maintain that solidarity with the movements that you're part of, the movements that you support, and not letting the government use scare tactics to distance support from these movements. And again, that's what the government's trying to do with these tactics all along, is really divide people, divide movements from being able to work collectively together. And it's important to maintain that solidarity with those that you're arm in arm with, that are fighting for the liberation of animals, fighting to defend forests, fighting to oppose oppression. Now, moving on to the next stage, I want to talk a little bit about federal investigations and grand juries. And I'm kind of overlapping a little bit already here, where there's the federal government and FBI, and that's the history of COINTELPRO. And then there's state actors that are, at the state level of local police, state police, etc. And there's a lot of overlap between those. And there's some nuance in terms of what tactics the federal government might use versus state governments, but these lessons generally apply across the board. Now, the area I'm going to focus on next is pretty specific to federal grand juries. And the federal grand jury system is designed where this is the process that the federal government uses to bring charges against people. And they're actual juries of regular civilians, and they make a decision whether or not to indict, whether or not to bring charges. They're in a jury room, and the prosecutor is there, and the prosecutor presents as evidence, and it's a very, very low bar of probable cause. It doesn't mean that there's enough to find that person guilty, but just enough to bring the charges. And there's a famous quote that a prosecutor could get a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich. And that's because the bar is so low and there's no opposition. It's only the prosecutor and the jury in that room. There's no judge. The person who's being investigated who's being targeted with facing these charges, they're not in the room. Their defense attorney isn't in the room. In fact, the whole process is completely secret. And that gives the government a lot of power. Now, this was originally designed in the early days of the founding of the US to actually protect against government overreach. But because of the secrecy and because of these tactics, it's had the exact opposite result. And right now, the government uses the grand jury as an investigative tool. And they do that by issuing subpoenas to people and to organizations. And so that can mean that if they're investigating something, and they issue a subpoena to get documents, for example, and that organization has to turn over those documents or figure out some sort of way to fight to not turn over those documents. Or they subpoena individuals to provide testimony. And so that means that somebody gets a subpoena, they have to appear before the grand jury and answer any questions and provide testimony. Now, again, that witness is in the room alone with the grand jury and the prosecutor. The witness doesn't have the right to have their own attorney, in the room with them. There's no judge, there's no right for the public to be in there. So it really allows for the government to use this power to really compel to gain a lot of information. And it's also very dangerous because it's so secretive that when the government targets movements, it's hard to know whether people are, what if anything people are saying in the grand jury. So that's why it's important, if people are ever in a situation where they receive a subpoena, to know that they have rights, because there's some rights that are very limited, but you need to be able to explore those and figure out what options you have and how to make decisions that are informed, that are based on your principles and based on your self-interest, along with the self-interest of your movement and the people that you're fighting alongside with. And to get into a little bit of the specifics there, people are probably familiar with the Fifth Amendment right in the United States, that you have a right not to be compelled to testify against yourself. So if you're arrested and charged with a crime, the government can't force you to take the stand and say whether or not you did what they're accusing you of doing. That doesn't apply in quite the same way in the grand jury. Because if the grand jury isn't targeting you, you might not have a Fifth Amendment right. You can say, okay, I might say something that might be incriminating, so I'm not going to cooperate. And then at that point, the government can give what's called use immunity. And that means when they say, and this is just a trick that gets around the fact that they're violating the Fifth Amendment, and they say, okay, well, we won't use anything that you say in the grand jury against you. But that doesn't mean that they can't still bring charges against you for it. They just can't use your own words for doing it. So let's say somebody is being accused of robbing a bank, and they're investigating a bank robbery. They can then say, okay, does this person know anything about that? And the person can say, I'm not going to talk to you. And they say, all right, well, we're not going to use anything you say against you. So therefore, you no longer have your Fifth Amendment right. And if that person says, yeah, I knew about the bank robbery, I drove the guy there, and that's that, then they can't use that testimony against you, but then they can go back and look through and say, okay, what kind of car was he driving? Can we find video of that car? Can we get other evidence now that we have this lead, and use it against them? So it's a very highly coercive, highly manipulatable tool that the government has in its pocket. And we've seen it used against social movements for years. During the Green Scare, we saw it used against lots of activists. And again, it's really important to talk to a lawyer, and not just any lawyer, but a movement lawyer, somebody who recognizes that political activists have interests that go beyond just their own personal life. That people that are active with groups and organizations and broader causes are considering other factors. And so it's important that you consult with a lawyer who understands those other factors and can advise you on what your rights are, and so that you can make the most informed decision for yourself. And I'll talk a little bit more towards the end, and I'll be happy to answer any questions about, how you can go about finding a lawyer like that if you don't already have a relationship with one. So again, this is a thing that it's very scary. Grand juries are a real threat, but you do have rights, you do have options, and make sure that you know those and figure out how to fight back. Another thing that's important to note here, and this is something I'm going to elaborate on when we go to the next section about how to protect yourself and protect your movements, is that the FBI isn't always targeting the people that they are actually, let me rephrase that. The government and the FBI in particular aren't always contacting the people that they're investigating or targeting. A lot of times, people that get the grand jury subpoenas might be more above ground organizations, or might be associates, friends, comrades, etc., of who they're actually targeting, right? They're trying to get the information. It's not necessarily that they're trying to serve a grand jury subpoena on the person that they think did a thing, but they're trying to get information more broadly. And a lot of times it's not even, it's so expansive and there's no oversight, that they're just trying to gain information to figure out who knows who, what the networks are, and get some of those pieces of information we were talking about what sort of tensions they can exploit. And so that specifically happens with, an aspect of federal investigation that's door knocks. And that's where the FBI shows up at your home, work, school, and, it's a lot of times straight out of the movies, right? It's two guys in suits, and one of them does the talking, the other one sits there and listens, and they knock on the door, and they try to get you to talk. And a lot of times that's, again, it can be anybody that they're knocking on the door for, right? It can be the person and a lot of times it's the person that's out there on the street who's well known, who's not doing anything illegal, but the government can claim that that person knows who's doing the illegal things, right? That the person who's standing out there with the sign every week and is known to the community, that might be the person that the FBI is knocking on their door. And it's important to know your rights, which I'll elaborate on as we wrap up. But in knowing your rights, that's you have the right to remain silent, and you have the right to an attorney. And so in those situations, the best thing you can do is to say you're not going to talk to them, and to get their name, their contact information, and then go contact a lawyer, have your lawyer contact them. And, I know that sounds really kind of scary and intimidating and hard to pull off, but there's lots of different ways you can do that, and you can say, my lawyer told me I'm not allowed to talk to you. So, just let's talk to my lawyer first, and then we'll see what we can do. Right. Give me your card. I'll have my lawyer call you, try to be friendly about it. You can, not open the door. If you see them out front, just leave the door closed. Tell them to slide the business card underneath the door and don't have a conversation with them. And again, I think a lot of times, and this is something I can elaborate on, a lot of times people feel like I have nothing to hide, right? And especially where you're engaged in above ground activism and not doing anything illegal, you think I have nothing to hide, so I can talk to them. But the problem is, one, lying to a federal agent is a federal crime. And so you can say something inadvertently that the government can then come back and say was a lie and try to charge you with something. And also, a lot of times the information that they're giving up, or that people are giving up, is something that they can then use down the road, and you don't even know how they're going to use it. It's really impossible to know where they're going with their investigation and to know all the implications and whether or not you're implicating other people in your movement. And again, a lot of times when they're knocking on doors, it's, friends, family members, loved ones, or activists who know other activists. And they use a lot of techniques to try to get you to talk, and they'll show you a photo, for example, of somebody that they know, and be like, do you recognize this person? This person's so-and-so, yeah? And like, just to reflexively get you talking. And so and in that moment, it's just impossible to know, again, what exactly they're trying to get from you, and to ensure that what you're saying isn't going to be coming back to implicate you or coming back to implicate somebody else. So again, the best way to handle that is to talk to a lawyer, again, a criminal defense lawyer, but especially a movement lawyer that has criminal defense experience, who can really advise you on that and really be a layer of protection between you and the FBI. Because that's one thing that really, once a lawyer says, I don't want you talking to my client, they're really supposed to honor that. And if they don't, then that really makes it harder for them to use anything against you or other people in court. So I'm going to wrap up in a few minutes here and leave some time for questions. But like I said at the beginning, I want to talk about, what we can do with this information and what steps we can take to protect ourselves and protect the movements that we're a part of. And one term that gets thrown around that people may have heard of is called security culture. And what that really means is, a set of practices that are just normalized, that kind of minimize the risk of the government gaining information that can be used against your movement. And it's really about just, again, the language of it, of creating culture, that it just becomes normalized and part of the culture. And so it's what people are doing all the time. And not just people that are engaged in high risk actions, but people that are just understanding that the movements are watching us, right? And that events like this are open to the public and are going to be posted on YouTube. And so, have to understand that what I'm saying here, a federal agent is likely to see at some point and be able to use anything I'm saying against me. And so it's just normalizing that what I'm saying is information that is being cautious and careful about that. And that's the same with when you're in meetings, when you're at actions, et cetera. It's just really being careful what you say, being careful what information you share. And that's really important in terms of not spreading rumors, not, engaging in speculation, especially when there are things that are more high risk or things that are unlawful. So, if you read about a mink liberation in another state, it might be exciting to you, and you might want to say how exciting it is, and you might want to talk to other people about how exciting it is and who you think might have done it. And that doesn't help anybody, right? That just creates more rumors. That starts getting things spinning around, and that ultimately doesn't help the animals. And also it's important to be careful how you share what information you're sharing, right? And that means who you're sharing information with, whether it's people you trust, whether it's somebody you just met for the first time. And it's all about kind of there's always a balance here, right? That when we're trying to organize above ground, we're trying to be open and inviting and welcoming to new people, but being careful not to try to mean that you can talk to everybody about everything. And that's an important part about security culture, is sort of sharing information on a need to know basis. And when you're all planning something that's above board and it's an action that everybody knows about and it's public, share that information freely and widely. But if there's an action that's, you're trying to catch a certain business by surprise, you don't want to share that information with people that you don't know, because you don't know whether they're going to share it in a different way or whether it's going to be more easy for that information to get in the wrong hands. And that's especially important on the internet. When you're on social media, what you post, not only publicly, but even in your private chats and things like that, because Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, these corporations have control over all of that information. And so at some point, if the government sends a subpoena to Facebook for somebody's messages, Facebook's going to turn that information over. And again, even if you're thinking they're not targeting me, you don't know who they're targeting. You don't know if the person that you're sharing messages with is engaged in something you don't know about or whatever else. And so it ends up getting really easy for information to get in the state's hands. And that's especially true where the tone of certain things might be a joke, right? And unfortunately, having done this work for a number of years, those jokes just don't land the same way in court. When your text messages are read out loud by the prosecutor, it doesn't read like a tee hee hee, let's go riot. They make that sound like this is this horrible thing. And then they also take it out of context, right? That you might have an inside joke with a friend about making Molotovs, and you can explain that, but you don't have the opportunity to explain that in most legal situations, right? And if you do try to explain it, it opens up more doors and makes it more complicated. So that's where, those kinds of things with just being careful of what you're saying, how you're saying it, when you're saying it. And again, it's easy to think that I'm a public activist. People know me. People know who I am. I'm not hiding anything. But a lot of that is stuff that can come back to the movement, right? And so I'll share one example of what I would say is bad practice here from myself before I became a lawyer. And I was planning on going to a protest, a very large mobilization in Canada. And I was trying to find out what crossing the border was going to be like. And so there was a website set up for people to share information. And so I made a post on the website saying, how strict is it going to be? Should we leave our gas masks at home? And I posted that with an email address that was my college email address. So I very publicly shared my name and the school that I went to. About a week later, I find out that the Vermont Border Patrol had contacted the security at my college. Now, when I made this post, I was thinking, I was half joking about gas masks, but I did have a gas mask and was trying to decide whether I should bring it with me. And in my mind, I was like, there's nothing illegal about having a gas mask. And I'm bringing it to protect myself against the tear gas that the police are going to shoot at us. So there's no harm in anything I'm doing. However, that alerted the law enforcement, who then contacted the security at my college, who then started asking questions about me, and not just about me. And then they started asking questions about the organizations I was a part of. And so they started asking the professors who were the advisors for the organizations, the activist organizations on campus. And so this was a thing where I could have just been a little bit more careful, and I could have just made an anonymous post, and that would have at least limited that, and limited that amount of exposure there. And who knows what might have happened or what did happen as a result of me being careless there in terms of what information about my friends and other activists I was organizing with, because again, I inadvertently let the government know that there was that I was engaged in this, intending to attend this protest. And then through that, they found out that I was part of these organizations, and I had other activist friends, and there was information being learned about those people, right? And so I put other people at risk through that I could have just taken some pretty easy steps of not putting something under my name, not putting something about my school. And it was really just because that was the email address I was using the most at that time. And I just thought it was going to be most convenient, right? So it's things like that are just trying to be a little bit more cautious, a little bit more careful. And again, even when you're not thinking you're doing anything illegal, and you're not you have quote unquote nothing to hide, it creates these kinds of risks there. So I'm going to be wrapping up in just a few minutes, but I do want to talk about the importance of lawyers and legal support, right? And so we as lawyers, we have a lot of ability to step in and help protect people. There's also lots of non-lawyer legal workers that have experience supporting people, and really encourage folks to connect with some of these legal solidarity groups as well. But if you don't have a local lawyer, and every jurisdiction's different. So the best case is to have somebody who's local, somebody you trust, somebody who's been active around. If you're in Chicago or the Midwest, me, People's Law Office, there's other lawyers through the National Lawyers Guild here in Chicago. There's also, if you're in the Pacific Northwest, there is Civil Liberties Defense Center, the CLDC. Also in New York and the East Coast, there's the Center for Constitutional Rights, CCR. These are all organizations that have provided legal support to activists, and particularly animal rights activists and people fighting for the environment as well. If you're not, if you're not in a location where you specifically know that there's a National Lawyers Guild chapter, and if people aren't familiar with NLG, again, if people want to give a thumbs up or a thumbs up if you do know what NLG is, or a wave if you don't know, that might help me know how much to explain. So the National Lawyers Guild is a volunteer organization in the US that was founded in 1937. That was the first racially integrated bar association at the time. And ever since then, NLG has been fighting for movements that are opposing oppression. And there's members all across the country. Some locations have active chapters, and the chapters have programs that do events that provide support. Here in Chicago, for example, we have a very active mass defense committee. And so that's, if people get arrested, we have a whole bank of volunteers who are trained and experienced in representing protesters, and we try to connect people with free representation there. There's some chapters where they are smaller and don't have those same sorts of resources. And then there's some places where there's a few members, but not chapters. But they do have a hotline, and I'll share the number here now. This is the Federal Defense Hotline. And so this was designed so that wherever you are in the US, if you get a grand jury subpoena, you get a knock on your door, you can call this number, and the NLG will do their best to connect you with a lawyer that's in your jurisdiction to help you there. You can also call, People's Law Office, like where I work, other law offices that do this kind of work, individual lawyers all across the country that do this kind of work. If you know us and you have that contact. And again, the CLDC, CCR, those are other organizations that I would really strongly recommend checking out. And specifically NLG, if you've ever seen at the protests, people wearing bright green hats, they're legal observers. And we have a legal observer program where we send legal workers, lawyers, and law students out to the streets wearing the bright green hats to watch the police and document what the police do. And then we use that information to help track people once they're arrested and make sure that people don't get lost in the system. And then we also have the ability for those people these legal observers, to testify in court. And so I personally have testified in criminal cases and successfully beat charges where another NLG lawyer was representing somebody who beat charges, where I testified as to what the police were doing that day and how they weren't letting people leave. And we were able to disprove the allegations that were being made. And, it was me as an independent legal observer. So it wasn't just another friend or activist, etc. So there's a certain layer of objectivity there that can be beneficial. And if you're active, if you're part of an organization locally, you know, I would encourage you to connect with the local NLG, or if there's lawyers that you know locally who have represented activists. I do want to say, you know, I think that there's very few of us that have this kind of experience representing protesters who are also deeply committed to animal rights and animal liberation. You know, a lot of the activist lawyers don't necessarily embrace veganism or animal liberation as a philosophy. So, you know, I think, but there's some people that are really, really down on that front, and I'm lucky to have friends across the country who are doing that. And, you know, I can drop my email in the chat. I'm happy to actually connect people wherever you are. I'm very excited that there's some international folks here. I don't know as many international lawyers, and I hope that some of this has still been interesting and useful, even though it's been very US centric. But yeah, I'll drop my email in the chat now, and people can feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And particularly if, you know, if you're active with an organization or a campaign in a certain part of the country, but you don't have any legal support, I'd be happy to try to connect you with folks locally, or that are in your region at least. And then, you know, if not, you can always have me where there's, you have a number that you can call where you're desperate, if things really go down that way and there's a knock at your door. And I'm hoping that that's never the case. But again, being prepared for that is really empowering, and to know what can come. I'm going to leave it at that, and so we have a little bit of time for Q&A, and but also in case people are ready to wrap up. I know that's a lot of information, so I apologize for that. And it's really, again, only a fraction of this, because, you know, movements have been successfully fighting exploitation and oppression for generations, for centuries. And as long as there's a state, the state's going to use the power they have to try to defend the status quo and shut down any movements that are really fighting and really succeeding. And especially when you're animal rights activists, you know, we're not only challenging society's perception of how we interact with other living things, there's also a financial incentive for the corporations and the industries that are profiting off of the exploitation of animals' bodies. And those corporations have money that they donate to politicians to pass laws to fuel this kind of repression. And so, you know, it's really important to acknowledge that this kind of repression exists and it's a threat, but that it exists because you all are successful in challenging the status quo and in creating change and liberating animals and liberating the earth. So with that, I will wrap up. And if anyone has any questions, I think Michelle is going to be reading some in the chat, but I don't know if you also want people raising their hands. Michelle, I'll defer to you.
Yeah, we can. Okay. Thank you, Brad, so much. That was so comprehensive, and it's so important to know your rights and to have resources. So we are going to open up now. I'm going to go to the chat first, since we got a few questions in the chat, but people are also welcome to hit the hand raise icon, and we'll try to get to all your questions and try to go back and forth between the chat and your hand raising. So, so Brad, the first one is from Yogi Free. Do you feel that the investigations into the deprivation of rights by the FBI is unbiased, and we can trust sharing the account of the police brutality with them?
Can you read that again?
Yeah. Do you feel that the investigations into the deprivation of rights by the FBI is unbiased, and we can trust the sharing the account of the police brutality with them?
If I'm understanding the question correctly, the example of police brutality, sharing that information with the FBI, who's investigating police misconduct, if I'm understanding that correctly. And, you know, the answer to the first part is no, I don't think it's unbiased. You know, and there's certainly the FBI, the government protects its own. And I understand that certainly people do share information in terms of those investigations, in terms of when the police have violated somebody's rights. And again, I would encourage you to connect with lawyers, particularly lawyers that do some of the work that we do, the civil rights work, to really know what information to share or not share, particularly where people are activists. And there's a big tension there where you might have to share information about your organization that you don't want to share, or that they're going to be asking questions that might be exposing something. But I'd certainly understand why people do want to do these work with these investigations into violations by the state. You know, I tend to not do that, and I personally don't have that kind of trust in the FBI in those investigations. I know other lawyers feel differently and other activists feel differently, but, you know, I come at this from an abolitionist perspective, that I feel like, you know, it's not just a matter of the right officers being in the right positions. It's really a matter of, like, at its core, our system is so inherently flawed and so rooted in white supremacy and anti-blackness that there might be some reforms that are beneficial to some people at some point, but at its core, you know, the system itself is just not able to be reformed to be just.
Okay, great. So I'm going to go to Tenebrae's question in the chat, and then Panima's question in the chat. That I'm going to go to Joseph, who has his hand up. Are Canada and U.S. ag-gag laws the product of the Animal Enterprise Terrorist Act?
That's a great question. And yeah, I didn't get a chance to talk about ag-gag. So if people aren't familiar with ag-gag, you know, it's agricultural gag laws, right? And these are various states have enacted laws that prevent, in some form, speaking out or sharing information about animal industries. And a lot of times that means people taking videos or photos or just sharing information about what's going on at slaughterhouses or other industries that are exploiting and harming and killing animals. And so those are separate laws from the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. And like I said before, you know, the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, that's federal. That's the whole country. Most of the ag-gag laws are at the state level. And the ag-gag it's coming out of the same sort of movement from the Green Scare and the same sort of tendencies of a collusion between animal industries and the government to target animal activists, but it's separate laws. And there's been a lot of litigation challenging those ag-gag laws. I personally haven't been involved in that, but there's some really great lawyers who are part of organizations like the ALDF, and, you know, PETA has brought some of these challenges, and a good friend of mine who's an animal rights lawyer named Matthew Strugar, who's based out of California. He's been involved in a good number of these cases where they've challenged these laws and succeeded.
Okay, great. So Panima's question from the chat: if you're accused of a crime in another state, should you seek legal counsel from someone where you're from or where you were accused of the crime?
That's a really good question. I would say, you know, if you have somebody you trust where you are, to go to them first, and they should be able to advise you as to whether they feel competent to be able to continue to advise you or represent you, or they can probably put you in touch with somebody else then who you can trust. If you don't know one way or another, but you know, I would say you probably want to prioritize wherever that you're being accused. And again, if it's federal or state crimes, that makes a difference. You know, if you're being charged with a federal crime, it's the same law, right? The Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, that's the same law being applied here in Illinois as it was being applied in California or Utah. But the state laws, if you're being charged with, you know, a disorderly conduct or resisting arrest in Illinois, it might be similar to what's in California, but there's going to be something a little bit different there. So yeah, I would say prioritize first going to somebody you trust, a lawyer that you have a relationship with. If you don't have that, then I would say trying to find one in wherever you're charged.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So Joseph, you have your hand up. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, I have a two-part question. Sorry, it might be complicated. So the first is about social media. So social media is a big part of activism, right, nowadays. So I've experienced, PETA the other day asked me to ask Anheuser-Busch to stop severing horses' tails. So I posted that on Instagram. My account got banned. So I'm just wondering, like, what kinds of oppression you're seeing, or if there's any rights that we have in terms of social media. And then the second question is to, like, activism in events in person. Is it beneficial to us, or is it worse to wear a body camera while doing activism events?
So yeah, those are two really great questions. So the answer to the first one is, yeah, these social media companies are private. So generally things like the Constitution don't really apply there. Now that's being actively challenged, and there's a lot of stuff going on with that. So that's a bit of an oversimplification, but the Facebook or Twitter, they can ban people, and there's sort of processes to get unbanned. But yeah, we've seen that a lot on Twitter, particularly since Elon Musk has taken over, that he's allowed white supremacists back on, but a lot of anti-fascist accounts have been shut down. A lot of more leftist activist groups have been shut down on Twitter. And, certainly again, where there's something like Anheuser-Busch, this massive corporation, it's them in bed with the government, and them in bed with another corporation at Twitter, Facebook, or whatever else to shut that down. So, there are some efforts to try to level the playing field and to try to challenge that, but unfortunately, there's not a lot there. Where you do have rights on social media is if a state actor blocks you. So that means if there's somebody who, either an agency or an individual account, and you're commenting, tagging them, etc., and they block you, you have a First Amendment right to bring a lawsuit there. And that's something that's a bit of a pet project of mine. So if anyone ever has situations like that, if you're, targeting the city council for, to enact a law to ban fur, for example, and they shut you down, and they ban you, then you have a First Amendment right to challenge that and get unbanned. But again, the fur company can ban you, and you don't have any recourse there. And maybe even Twitter can kick you off if they're saying you're harassing another account. Hopefully that answered the first question. The second question, that's a situation I would be careful on getting body camera, or having how much video you take. And I think it really depends on the nature of the action, what sort of agreements you have with the other people that are participating in the action, because sometimes if you have video that you might need to turn over at some point, then the police can use that against people there. And we see that a lot of times with instances of resisting arrest, for example, that police start to arrest somebody and then they make some sort of physical movement and they get charged with resisting arrest. The video might show that physical movement in a way that they can use against those people. And, there's also sort of safety concerns that depending on the movement, some people don't, the movement, the action, etc., some people don't want their faces documented, and want to maintain some privacy and anonymity there. So I think it really depends on those types of situations. Having said all that, a lot of these actions, it is extremely beneficial to have video. And especially where, for example, a lot of the campaigns that are really active right now in the animal rights movement of targeting for corporations selling fur. You're seeing private employees, private security for these companies just being really brutal to activists. And that's stuff that I think is helpful, both from a legal standpoint, but also from a public relation standpoint, right? That, a big fashion company doesn't want to be exposed for having their employees shoving people, knocking people around, etc. So I would say that I definitely see the advantages on that, but that I also think that there's risks. And so to be thoughtful and careful and intentional about that. And also when you get video, and whether or not you think it can be useful or harmful, that not just holding on to stuff that you're like, oh, look at this wild video I have where I didn't expect somebody to smash the window of that for a company, but now I've got the video and you can see their face, and you start having conversations at parties about how you got the video of it and you're showing it at parties. That's an example of where that would be particularly bad security culture, where then somebody hears that there's this video exists and you're the one that has it, and then there might be a knock at your door at that point. So that would be a particular example of a higher risk kind of thing. So hopefully that answers. And I'm just seeing that going live on social media too. And that's especially a case where I think if you don't know what's about to go on, and you don't, there's not sort of clear agreements, it can get really, really high risk there. But again, that of course, that's an activist and organizer decision. And generally, I really try to empower organizers to make those decisions for what makes the most sense for their campaign, for their action, for what that particular grouping or organization is trying to prioritize. But to be mindful about how it can have negative impacts.
Okay, I'm going to go to Dana's question in the chat, and I'm going to go to Tom, who has his hand up. Can you have a lawyer set up just in case of something? I've looked on NLG's website and found many where I am. However, I don't know if you need to put money down before or talk to them or just have the number for if I'm ever in jail. So can we get a just in case lawyer?
Sure, yeah. And there's certainly, you can do that either hiring somebody or a lot of movement lawyers, activist lawyers we do make ourselves available for that type of stuff. And I've had clients that, because they were involved in a certain action, say, hey, can I call you if something happens, right? And anything you say to a lawyer, if it's just between you and your lawyer, and this is even if you haven't hired them, that's attorney-client privilege conversations. Now, if you have it in a public place, if you do it, online, like this isn't an attorney-client conversation, but if one of you contacts me to ask for my legal advice, that's a privileged conversation, and I cannot repeat it under the ethical rules within being a practicing attorney. So that's to say that you can contact a lawyer and talk to them about what your concerns are and find out whether they're available to be on call, whether or not that's something that you would have to pay a retainer for. And that really depends. A lot of solo practitioners, lawyers that have their own practice, they may or may not be able to do that pro bono for free. But they might be willing to do that for a small fee and say, yep, for this amount of money, if you ever get arrested, I'll show up at the police station and visit you. If the FBI ever comes to your house, I'll call. You can call me and I'll be on call. But certainly, I would say it's worth contacting lawyers, especially if it's a legitimate concern and not just theoretical and hypothetical, but saying, hey, I'm part of this campaign that's been really active, or if there's anything in your community that's been going on. And that's something I should have said earlier. When you get these knocks on the door, it's important to share very factual information with other people in your community, right? if there's grand jury subpoenas out there, if there's people being doors knocking, it just helps other folks to be kind of on the on alert a little bit. And it kind of helps remind all of us, both lawyers, to be like, okay, keep an eye out for this, but also to know, all right, as an activist, the cops might knock on my door. And as a reminder, I need to say, I'm not going to speak without a lawyer. I'm going to remain silent. And I saw a comment there about the attorney-client privilege if it applies to advisory attorney. And so, yeah, that's even if you don't have a case in court, calling up a lawyer and asking them for advice on the phone, trying to get them to represent you, that's all established as an attorney-client conversation, and that's all privileged. So I hope that answered that question.
I think you did. That was great. Okay, Tom, you're next. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
So I hope it works. So I'm one of these international folks, Brad called it. So I'm not a native speaker. So if it sounds stupidly, I'm sorry for that. I think I got also a two-part question with a little bit more look on the what means organization in a movement. What do you think, which part is to train things like police contact, to share the knowledge? Like, I think it's important, as we see, as we're talking about it tonight. So, but if I do an animal rights group, do you think it is good if it be a part to think about the repression, and some tips how can we implement it? And the other part is, you talked a lot about historical stuff, and I think I'm a historian, so I think this would be very important, also be part of the structure of a movement, to think about the own history and to learn from all these processes. Do you also think this it is very important to deal with these topics?
Yes, absolutely. I think those are great questions. And what you said in the second part of your question was what I was going to say, is that I think to answer your first question about how to talk about this in movements, I think it's really helpful to talk about the history, right? To know what's happened, both positive and negative, right? Know what movements have been successful, learn about what protests where there's been arrests and people defeated the charges, right? To learn about these kinds of campaigns and what applies or not, and that's one of the things that, what's going on in Atlanta, for example. I see a lot of similarities to the Shack case. I see a lot of similarities to other movements throughout history in the US and elsewhere. And I also see a lot of lessons that the people on the ground have learned and really protected themselves on the ground in Atlanta. So I think that that's all really, I completely agree that history is essential and it's beneficial to movements to be learning from that. And I do think that it's great for organizations to be talking about it. And I think it's great that AAM here is hosting this kind of event for us to share some of this and discuss this.
All right, thanks for your question, Tom. Thank you, Brad, for your answer. So are there any more questions? We have time for maybe one more, maybe two more before we wrap up, depends. So anybody else have a question? Did I miss any questions? Anybody that were in the chat? I don't think I did. Or does anybody else want to raise their hand? Or does anybody have a comment to make or an experience, maybe just a brief one though, an experience that you've had with the legal system, with your rights and all of that? Okay, Yogi, free your hand. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. So I just wanted to sort of go back to the original question regarding speaking with the FBI in an investigation into the deprivation of rights that was that was based off of police brutality. So if the person that is the victim of the police brutality is unable to get any type of legal assistance in the matter, you know, sort of expecting that because that's sort of like the way to go is to file the complaint, you know, against the police for that. Sort of how, you know, I know it's challenging because they are for their team, right? So it's hard to say that they're going to be completely unbiased. But what do we do then? You know, because it's like we have to, you know, what do? We can't just like not do something.
Yeah.
Right.
And so, you know, I mean, what we do at our office is, you know, we bring the civil lawsuits, right? And so that means we sue the cops. And that's, you know, I think that is what I advocate for. You can get compensation for that. That's essentially a civil suit where you're trying to get money from the police, from the city, to compensate you for whatever harm you suffered.
So
But
you don't
beyond
feel that, and I apologize, Brad, because I do have that in the work. So that's been done. But I felt like the other portion of it, because that's the civil part, you know, so
Yeah.
it's like the other portion of it, do you feel like complements it in a way, you know, because it's a, you know, sometimes people really, you know, it's just like they don't care, you know, because it's just the money versus it being them being the oppressed ones, you know?
Yeah. And so it's sometimes, you know, sometimes it can help, it can complement it. Where, you know, and it really depends on what agencies we're talking about, you know, and most of my lawsuits are against the city of Chicago, not all of them, but there is what's called COPA, which is the organization, the entity that investigates the police. Now, there's been some cases where COPA has investigated and they made a finding that, yes, this officer did violate the law and held that officer accountable. And that does help in the civil lawsuit. And a lot of times information is gathered through that investigation that we might not have in the lawsuit. Sometimes the investigation can be harmful to the lawsuit. And sometimes that means that, you know, if the person who's harmed, if they're required to go through a really extensive interview or some sort of process where they have to give a lot of information, one that can sometimes be really re-traumatizing for them, especially if the result is that nothing happens, right? And that's part of what's part of my hesitation on that, is because it feels so far out of my control as a lawyer to try to keep protecting that people. In the civil suit, you know, it's my job to be representing that client and advocating for that client and protecting them. There's a little bit of that role in the investigation, but when it's a third-party entity and it's a government agency investigating another government agency, the amount of power that the lawyer has to really protect and advocate for their client is limited. And then sometimes if it's just a whitewash, it doesn't help your client and it doesn't help the case. So it's really, really fact specific there, based on the jurisdiction, based on what the person who's harmed goals are, what their priorities are, what's there on balance. And, you know, through civil suits, it's like you said, you know, and like I mentioned, it's mostly financial compensation, but often you can have other impact as a result on that, right? Either through a settlement or verdict or some sort of injunctive relief. You can try to get something more and some other level of accountability, but then also just getting information that can then be exposed, you know, and that's something that is very important in my office. And that's, we've always approached as this being beyond just an individual case, but when you get information that the public needs to know about, to do what we can to share that, to really expose the injustices, because that's really where, in my view, that's where accountability comes from, right? It's from the pressure from organizers, from people on the ground. And so when those kinds of investigations, government investigations happen, where there's support and where there's advocacy on the ground, that I think can be really important there. So especially if it's in conjunction with movements that are fighting to expose the injustice, there is a role for it. But again, it's like a lot of these things, it's fact specific and there's tensions and there's contradictions. And, you know, people need to make their own decisions based on what's important to them, and ideally through the advice of an attorney that understands some of those goals as well.
Okay, so it's really just a matter of having the civil and then the other agency doing the investigation, but it's a matter of them both sort of coming to the same outcome in a way as far as the accountability is concerned, but one having, you know, who's like the victim's rights in mind versus not, right?
Yeah, and a lot of times those processes, you know, whether it's like the FBI that's investigating the police, you know, they really don't, you know, a fraction of the time do they ever really bring any criminal charges against the police, or do they ever really have any sort of accountability there. And so it should be getting the same goal, but it rarely does. So, you know, but if you or another person who's in this position has a civil lawyer, I definitely think like talking to them, find out what the options are. They can explain kind of the pluses and minuses, because it should be sort of in conjunction with a civil suit anyway.
Okay, got it. Okay, thank you. I appreciate you sharing that.
Thank you for your great questions. So without any further questions and in the interest of time, I'm gonna ask Brad for any final words, or I always like to ask for a final message of hope is sort of what I ask for at the end, but folks, don't go anywhere even after Brad's comments, because I just have a few more great announcements and some information. So hang in there with us if you're able to stick around. Brad, any final words?
Yeah, and then just to reiterate, I know this is a lot of intense information. It's a lot of stuff that can be scary and intimidating. But what's important to know is that the reason the government's coming after people is because people are being successful, and that you need to keep doing the work. You can't let yourself get scared away from it. You just need to know what to do to protect yourself and to protect your movement. And that means building solidarity and building a culture of standing strong with people who are in your groups, in your movements, in movements that are aligned with yours, and to always keep that core of solidarity there and know that we can fight and we can win.
Thank you, Brad. I think you successfully left us on a hopeful note. Thank you so much. And Brad, if you have information that you want to leave in the chat, you know, in regards again to how people can reach you, feel free to do that. But I am going to wrap up with just a few quick kind of announcements and information. First, I want to announce our upcoming workshops. On Thursday, March 30th, we have Anthropomorphism as Activism with Karen Davis. On April 6th, we have Dominionism and Domestication, the History of Animal Exploitation with author Jim Mason. And again, please check out our previous workshops. They're all archived on YouTube, our YouTube channel, which maybe Trey can put the link for that. And subscribe, folks. Thank you so much for that. I'd also like to announce our 2023 live events. We have several. The AAM Washington, D.C. Week of Action is taking place March 14th through the 20th, coming up. The Colorado Convergence is taking place in and around Denver. The dates are June 24th through the July 1st. And the Ohio Occurrence is being held September 1st through the 3rd in and around Cincinnati. And we have another live event in the works as well. No experience required, but registration is required. So you'll find the events on our Facebook page and website. And again, maybe Trey will put in the chat the links for those event pages so you can sign up. Also, Brad mentioned a couple of books, which if you are considering buying them, please go to our bookshop where you'll find those as well as other resources recommended by AAM. If you buy, we get 10% off of the proceeds. And that's just another way of helping us out. Plus you get your great book. And the link is in the chat, the link to our bookshop. And on that same note, please consider becoming a patron by finding AAM on Patreon. If you're watching live right now, there's a link in the chat where you can donate to support our workshops. and all the work we do at AAM. If you're watching the replay on YouTube, please donate by using the link in the description. Your donations allow AAM to continue to provide free educational resources for activists, which ultimately saves more animals, which is why we're all here. So that wraps up another AAM workshop. Thank you, Brad, for your time and wisdom. Thank you all for being here and the tireless work you're doing for the animals. Again, if you're interested in becoming a mentor or mentee or want to get involved with AAM, check out our website, animalactivismmentorship.com. If you'd like to be in our email newsletter list, if you're not already, please drop your email in the chat. All right, folks, well, that is it for now. So until next time, thank you. Stay strong and live vegan, everyone.